Well, let's get the view from the opposition, and I can now speak to the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Good morning. Good morning,
Hi, good
Lisa.
morning, Trevor.
You used to be Shadow Foreign Secretary. What should the current Foreign Secretary and the rest of the government be saying and doing about this situation in Russia and Belarus now?
Well, I think largely, actually, unusually perhaps for a politician, I think they should be doing pretty much what they are. I think they should be mindful of the fact that there's a major impact on Russian civilians of the events of the last 36 hours, that this is an enormously volatile situation. It's very difficult to predict what it means for Russia in particular, but what it does do is expose the fragility of the Russian government. And it's clear that Ukraine is winning the war. We now need to make sure that all of the NATO allies stand not just with President Zelensky and Ukraine to send a clear message to President Putin that we will be there and with the Ukrainian people until that war is won, but also to show a completely united front against a splintering set of Russian forces. The phone call between the UK, the US, France and Germany was extremely welcome. We need to see more of that cooperation and us standing together in support of Ukraine and against the actions of President Putin.
OK, let's see if we can keep this outbreak of harmony going when we turn to domestic matters. You asked the government to agree a series of things with the banks to deal with the rising mortgage rate. And by my reckoning, actually, they've done most of them. One cheer for the Chancellor?
Well, the key is whether these measures are mandatory or not, and we understand that they're not. We estimate that significant numbers of people won't be able to access any support at all unless the measures become mandatory, so that all mortgage payers, not just some, have access to these measures that give them more flexibility to extend mortgage terms, to be able to shift from one type of mortgage to another. We want clarity about whether there'll be any fees or tariffs attached to changing the terms of your mortgage. We want to ensure that it won't affect people's credit rating if they take up these offers. These are all questions that the Chancellor has to be able to answer if people are to be confident that there is help coming now and they'll be able to stay in their homes. But more importantly, for far too long, even before the Tories crashed the economy and sent mortgages through the roof, we've had an affordability crisis in this country. The reason that people are feeling a lot more pain now than they were in the 90s is because the average buyer in the 90s was borrowing 3 or 4 times their annual salary. Now they're borrowing around 11 times of their annual salary. There is no answer to this crisis without building more homes, and that's exactly what Labour will do.
Well, everybody wants to build more homes, but let's just deal for the moment, if we can, with what's going to happen in the next few months. Whether it's mandatory or not, all of these measures are, to some extent, about making a bad situation not so bad, so people don't lose their homes and so on. But what can you do about the root cause here, which is inflation? I asked John Glenn what policy he would have to make things different this right now. What would Labour do? Give me one thing that Labour would do to affect inflation right now.
Well, one of the measures that we're pushing the government to take on today is the fact that banks have passed on interest rates rises to mortgage payers, but they haven't passed on those same interest rate rises to savers. If you make it more attractive for people to save, then it does have a significant effect in cooling inflation. So there are good reasons why the government ought to be intervening to ensure that banks pass on those interest rate rises to savers as well, and we're asking the government to do that today.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but how does putting more money in the pockets of savers reduce inflation? Actually, traditionally, orthodox economics says it would do exactly the opposite.
Well, what we're proposing is that the government ensures that those rises are passed on so that it's more attractive for people to put money into savings in order to help cool the economy. It can't be right that banks are passing on interest rate rises to mortgage payers and not to savers. We think that's a sensible and proportionate thing for the government to be doing. Ultimately, there are a number of ways in which any responsible government should be seeking to tackle the inflation crisis, but we think that one of the ways that we can get out of this mess is to get the economy growing. And, forgive me, but you said that there's obviously everybody wants to build more houses, but the government has just abolished local housing targets, which has sent house building off a cliff, projected to fall to its lowest level in a generation. And the House Builders Federation projects that that will have a £17 billion cost to the economy. The only route out of this crisis in the end is to bring some calm and stability to the markets and to start getting the economy growing in every part of Britain. And that's what Labour proposes to do.
But forgive me, if I may just take you back to the policy that you're espousing today, which is to put more money in the pocket of savers. And actually, by your own figures, I was looking at the release that you put out today, somebody'd have to have £10,000 in savings to get an extra 50 quid a year from what you're proposing. How is that going to affect inflation?
Because it makes it more attractive for people to put money into their savings account rather than
the effect of 50 quid a year
in the economy.
If anybody's got 10,000 to keep in a savings bank, I mean, the effect will be marginal, wouldn't it?
Sure, but what you're looking at when you're looking at an inflation crisis of this magnitude is a number of multifaceted ways in which any government has to tackle it. That's what the Chancellor says that he's doing. We're proposing constructive ways in which he can help to ease the burden and ease the pain for people right now, and one of those ways is just to ensure basic fairness in the way that the banking industry is operating. If they're passing on interest rate rises to mortgage payers, they should be passing them on to savers as well, and we think that would have perhaps a small effect but a significant effect put together with other measures in order to cool inflation and try and take the heat out of the economy.
All right. The Chief Secretary of the Treasury wouldn't commit to implementing the recommendations of the independent pay review bodies, 6%, 6.5% for teachers and other public sectors workers. Would Labour commit to implementing the recommendations of the pay review bodies?
Well, we haven't seen them, and we will obviously take them seriously. Pay review bodies are instructed by the government to look at a range of factors. They take evidence from interested parties and then they make recommendations accordingly, so they deserve to be taken seriously. But it's worth noting that we are not in government. We haven't been allowed access to the accounts. So we don't know what the situation is, and ultimately it is for governments to decide whether to accept those recommendations or not. If we were in government right now, we would be asking the pay review bodies to give far more weight to the recruitment and retention crisis in the recommendations that we make. We take seriously their recommendations, but we wouldn't be bound for them. Ultimately, we'd be seeking a far more constructive relationship with our trade unions and our frontline workforce so that we could negotiate our way through what is a very, very difficult situation, not just in addressing the issues around pay for frontline workers, but also addressing the issues around working conditions. In the NHS, for example, it's one of the major challenges and one of the major reasons that people tell us that they're leaving is because they just cannot see light at the end of the tunnel. They're so overworked, as well as struggling to put food on the table.
You're in the same place as government is on that question. Let's have a look at a couple of the specific disputes. The railway workers, the RMT, want 8.7%. You sympathetic? Would you? I understand you'd be negotiating and so on, but would you be negotiating around that 8.7% figure?
Well, of course, we'd be negotiating around the requests that they've made and what is ultimately affordable and sustainable. We won't make promises that we can't keep, but asking me to conduct a negotiation live on air and make a decision about that when I haven't seen the books would be a bit like asking me to advise somebody how much more they could afford to pay on their mortgage at the moment without having seen their bank account. It's just not something that an opposition can or should responsibly be doing. But I will challenge you on one thing. We certainly wouldn't be taking the approach that this government has been taking. Even today, we've had the Education Secretary out attacking our frontline teaching workforce for the actions that they're taking without any acknowledgement that the government has caused absolute havoc in the education system over the last 13 years, but particularly over the last few years during COVID, when they chopped and changed their rules and regulations at the whim of their backbenchers, and it's children and young people who've paid the price.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but I can't let you go without asking you about this question. Political correspondents are reporting that several female Labour MPs have expressed concern that all the Labour candidates for the upcoming by-elections are white males. Does that bother you?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's something that we take very seriously in the Labour Party. I myself was selected on an all-women shortlist. People say now I would have been selected anyway, but the truth is that until and unless we change the perception of what a Member of Parliament looks like, that wasn't going to change. We've reached the threshold with the being allowed to use all women shortlists again, but for me and others across the Labour Party, it's incumbent on us to go out and make the case for why we need more women and more diversity in Parliament, and particularly at local level. If we're going to affect the biggest transfer of power out of Westminster and Whitehall in modern British history, which we are, we need to make sure that our mayors and our council leaders and our cabinet members are representative of the communities they serve, and we're absolutely committed to doing that.
Lisa Nandy, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.